Do you relate to the outsider? When there's a character in a story who is misunderstood, underappreciated, overlooked, do you connect with them? Sometimes we feel sorry for them, compare our own lots in life, and feel a sense of relief. I'm not the only one. Ray Bradbury, the king of speculative fiction, can write a mean story about Martians and rockets. But let's not forget the man's earthbound tales are just as poignant and thought-provoking. A man who's different from the rest of us. He not only thinks differently, he looks different. He's a dwarf. Novel Meets Evil is a true crime podcast where we compare literary characters from modern fiction to real cases to see what we can learn about human nature. You think you know your neighbors, your coworkers, your spouse, but the real creeps hide in plain sight every day. What's behind the curtain? What are they hiding? Do you really want to know? And why are you so eager to look? What are you hiding? I'm here to tell you that there's nothing wrong with looking. Just don't stare. It'll give you the creeps. He's a dwarf. His name is Bigelow, Mr. Big. He feels the eyes on him as he walks the carnival boardwalk past the haunted house, the popcorn stands, the roller coaster, the whirling cotton candy machines, the freak show, en route to the one place in this cruel world where he can find peace. He imagines the thoughts of passersby as they stare. Would you just look at that poor dwarf, all deformed, all shrunken and ugly? How terrible his existence must be. How sad. But he is anything but sad, because he knows in just a moment he will feel normal again. Every evening, Bigelow would shuffle up to the booth and stretch his arm up to give the dime to the attendant and hurry off into the mirror maze. Down the hallway, he disappears. Across the tipping gravity floor, past jets bursting with air, through the mirror maze, a million flashes of his little running feet. There they are, the funhouse mirrors. One in particular is convex, stretching out the image of anyone standing in front of it, the kind that makes a child look tall. In the dwarf's case, it performs a miracle. It corrects his deformity. His proportions look normal in that bulging surface. Now he feels like a real man, all measurements to the right scale. He poses in front of the mirror, watches his other self just walking, turning around suavely. He even dances and sachets. He is cured. For now. The ticket attendant, Ralph, finds this charade hilarious, explaining to his girlfriend, "You should have seen this little runt head back there, my God." "Oh yes," said Amy, remembering. "I always wonder what it's like to be a dwarf. I always feel so sorry for him when I see him. I could play him like an accordion." "Don't say that." "My lord," Ralph patted her on the thigh with a free hand. "The way you carry on about guys you never even met." He shook his head and chuckled. "Him and his secret, only he don't know I know, see?" Ralph chuckles every time he sees the small figure approaching the ticket counter, shakes his head as the little guy disappears into the mirror maze. After closing the ticket counter, Ralph sneaks away to his secret peephole, through which he ogles the little man as he casually enjoys a cigar, quietly laughing at Mr. Big's misfortune. What a guy. For much of the story, our audience point of view is a fly on the wall next to the ticket counter, witnessing Ralph's cruel jibes at the expense of Mr. Big and the disgust the empathetic Amy feels toward her lunkhead beau. "Leave this idiot, Amy. There's a lot of fish in the sea." To Ralph's continued surprise, Amy actually takes a shine to the dwarf. She finds him fascinating in his pressed suit and fedora, the keenness behind his dark eyes. She just wants him to be happy, just wishes he could find a place where he feels safe and at home. Why does he keep coming back here every day, she wonders aloud. Ralph closes the booth temporarily and takes Amy back to his private spying place, where she sees the dwarf posing and strutting in front of his stretched reflection. Amy is heartbroken. Ralph is entertained. Many of us, like Amy, would want to help Bigelow. But what can be done? He's a dwarf, and he'll always be a dwarf. Now, if this was Bradbury writing in a different mood, the dwarf might step into the mirror world where he is now 6 feet tall, but everyone else is now 20 feet tall. Insert sci-fi hijinks. That might actually be a decent setup to a story. He's finally a normal man, but everyone else is still superior. No, that's more of a Roald Dahl story. But alas, this is a more grounded Ray B. One day the dwarf's voice, pinched and high, asks Ralph timidly how much he thinks one of those funny mirrors might cost. Ralph brushes him away, saying he would never be able to afford it. A different time, the dwarf actually quotes a number to Ralph. Do you think it's more than that? Just keep paying your dime and we'll all stay happy. This time Amy hears the back and forth, and it gives her an idea. She wants to help him and decides to scrape together the money and buy him his own mirror to have at home. Amy excitedly explains to Ralph that she has investigated Mr. Bigelow and found out that he is a writer, a real, honest-to-goodness author of detective stories, murder mysteries, crime dramas. This is from the book. She held up the magazine. I'll read you part of the crime story. It's got all the guns and tough people, but it's told by a dwarf. I bet the editors never guessed the author knew what he was writing about. Oh, please don't sit there like that, Ralph. Listen. And she began to read aloud. I am a dwarf, and I am a murderer. The two things cannot be separated. One is the cause of the other. The man I murdered used to stop me on the street when I was 21. Pick me up in his arms, kiss my brow, croon wildly to me. Sing rockabye baby, haul me into the meat markets, toss me on the scales and cry, watch it, don't weigh your thumb there, butcher. Do you see how our lives move toward murder? This fool, this persecutor of my flesh and soul? As for my childhood. Clearly, Ralph now realizes that Amy is more than just a little infatuated by the dwarf, and decides to play a prank on the little runt. The next time Mr. Big politely plops down his dime and disappears into the funhouse, there is a moment. Just silence. Then a scream. A cry from deep inside the building. Ralph grins, slapping his thigh in glee. The dwarf, shrieking hysterically and sobbing, runs out of the maze. Amy feels horribly guilty at this. Ralph would never have played such a trick if he weren't jealous at her interest in Mr. Bigelow. Another carnival employee burst into the ticket booth in a panic. Someone swiped one of the pistols from the shooting gallery. A manhunt ensues. Amy beats herself up over it, but not Ralph, of course. The man couldn't be at fault. Stories like these are always a really amazing window into vintage misogyny. No one is perfect, and on some level we all wish we could magically become a better version of ourselves with the snap of our fingers. A couple inches taller, more attractive, darker complexion, lighter. Then a magical car salesman pops out and says, "Hey man, I was listening to your thoughts just now, and I think I can help you out with your little problem. You think you're fat, and every time you see a real-time image of yourself, that's what you see. That's how you feel. It's all about feeling fat. What if I told you I could make you feel thinner? Anytime you look at your reflection or the numbers on the scale, they'd say 160 pounds, 6'3", whatever you like." Will I look thinner, you ask? No, of course not. I can't change the reality, but I can send you the visual feedback you want to see. Isn't that what matters? The salesman spins his diamond-studded cane. Perception? So you agree to the deal, and suddenly every storefront window as you pass by, every self-check camera monitor, they all show you the new and improved version of you. You stand up straight, proud, you feel sexy and competent. The new you is working. You're smart enough to know it isn't really real. But it's still pretty good, eh? But then one day, poof, it's gone. You look at your reflection in a restaurant window, you see the projected image of you in the waiting line at the pharmacy, and you recoil. Who is that pig? It's me. Your confidence blows away in the wind and your posture falls. You can no longer walk as fast as you could when you thought you looked fitter. It's like the movie Joker. It's the one thing holding that person together. They've whittled their life down to that one thing. You You don't kick the last leg out from under the table and not expect a mess to follow. And so you do what any self-respecting modern consumer would do. You go on a rampage, like falling down. This is a silly scenario, but it's also hauntingly close to the realities of a lot of us modern people, living to satisfy one little urge after another, warding off critical voices, disappearing into fantasy worlds because they provide a tiny bit of relief. A prettier reflection than real life. This is what this episode's novel segment is about. In addition to the themes of the lies we tell ourselves, this story is about people my wife would call petty. Petty people are dangerous. I have to fight against this characteristic myself because unfairness and inconsistency really bug me. I can't seem to let them go like a more mature person might do. I have to resist the urge to do tit for tat when I see someone not holding themselves to the standards they expect from others. It bothers me across the board, even when I catch myself doing it. Like many people, I hate to be proven wrong, at least at first. My ego steps up and says, hey, fuck off. Don't shine a light on me, especially when I suddenly realize I'm wrong. But eventually, it will make me better. Realizing things about yourself, like this personality flaw, bringing them to the surface and into the light, my therapist says this is a start of healing. I'm just kidding, I don't have a therapist. I do want one, though. I have regrets about this flaw of mine. A diversion on pettiness. As a musician and producer, I once mixed a very well-recorded album for a talented artist. We'll call him Joe Jones. And I made certain decisions out of spite because the amazing recording engineer, let's call him Gary, challenged me on why I wasn't using the room mic tracks he'd recorded. I felt my caveman DNA start to rise up, my face getting hot. I was like, oh, you think I should highlight the room mics? Okay. How about I just mute them for the whole record then? Now how do you like it? It's a petty tendency to rub it in to my opponent, even if I also suffer as a result of the decision. I've worked with enough actual professionals in New York City now to realize that a real professional does whatever will make the piece better and be a grown-up about it. A makeup artist swooping in on a film shoot to touch up an actor's splotchy skin is not an attack on the actor. They can see things you can't, and they just want to make the product better. Well, the Joe Jones record sounds fine, even good. But the expert engineer in question was absolutely right, because my own drum recordings weren't recorded in a stellar room like his tracks were. It was my habit to run the drums through an outboard Lexicon reverb unit to simulate all sizes and shapes of drum rooms or sample plates, because I knew it well. It wasn't necessarily good. It definitely wasn't better. I used the Lexicon all the time to cover up inadequacies of my non-professional recording setup. My 20s were basically me having a great time in my home recording laboratory, learning the weaknesses in my setup, the sound of the rooms in my house I recorded in, the mics I used, all the different instruments and digital tools, and figure out how to make the most of all of that, even trying to use them as strengths if possible. My drum recordings wouldn't sound full and shiny in the way that Gary's would, but they would sound like my house, and no one else would have that exact sound. Like a personal brand on a shoe I'm helping the actual shoemaker finish in my little shoe cobbling enthusiast lab. Not wanting to introduce a new tool into the creative process late in the game is a valid reason for a creative choice, to a point. I thought, why throw myself a curveball, even if it has the potential to be better just because it's available? But with the Joe Jones record, I was wrong. I even knew it at the time. I had my own reasons, as lame as they were. As an aside, Joe was at my house with a friend of ours, and he was lamenting that he had a hard drive with too many tracks for anyone he knew to load in Pro Tools, a mixing software. I just blurted out, let me try it. I can mix it for you for cheap. That's all it took, and I was mixing the record. Joe had heard other stuff I'd worked on, and so it was not completely random, but still, I was doing him a favor. I don't remember why Gary wasn't mixing it, but there must have been a good reason. In my own recording setup called The Womb, I would play around with all kinds of experimental techniques. Some of them even worked. I had a pretty big room with the drum kit set up all the time with close mics and then have a garbage can mic, down in the bathroom mic just for effect. I had a solid 70s psychedelic drum sound, but never a pristine drum room like Gary's. He had built a completely controlled, great-sounding, treated room, and I was recording in the womb. a 4th-floor brownstone in Columbia Heights in Washington, D.C. I had listened to Gary's drum room tracks, and they sounded good. Like really good drum reverb on the lexicon, but I thought at the time that it was limiting me to a certain sound. I was used to dialing in any size of room, any tone, digitally with the lexicon. Gary was asking me on the phone to use his bloody drum room tracks that he'd put so much time, expert artistry, and effort and money to get the legit world-class drum sound. And my dumbass said, "No, I'm going to make this into a me-sounding record, not what you intended, because now I'm making it my project." I liked limitations. I wanted the limitations I was used to. I wanted my comfort zone, and I didn't want to be told how to mix a record. Pettiness doesn't define who I am as a whole. A lot of us have aspects of this. My dad cursing at other drivers on the road for not signaling. It was the first time I'd ever heard the term fuckstick used in a sentence. Nice directional fuckstick, I think it was. So I do have to resist the urge to freak out and hit back, even in little ways. With Joe Jones, thankfully, Gary had recorded everything so flawlessly and the playing was near perfect, so it made my work hard to F up. Mistakes like that pop into my head as I walk around, and I try not to beat myself up too much. But I deserve a little beating for that. You live and you learn. At the world-class voiceover and film sound studio where I work now, A-list voice actors are in there every day, faces and voices from movies and TV, where there is an understanding that the celebs get away with more because of who they are. Unreasonable demands are normal, people being critical and bitchy. But it's almost never a problem. The professionals on their team make it so that they can't put the kibosh on the whole project just from a bad attitude. Also, unless you're a huge star, you don't get very far being a nasty, needy jerk. Still, prima donnas do exist. Re-enter the very petty Ralph. In The Dwarf, I relate to the surface-level tough guy Ralph, who is actually self-conscious and hasn't dealt with that. And thus, he victimizes people who won't put up much of a fight. People who, as any good bully subconsciously suspects, are actually better than him. And those underdogs, the bully prey, often end up rising above people like our ticket attendant. As soon as Ralph realized Amy was actually interested in Mr. Big, he lashed out. "No, I don't think so, little man. You aren't going to replace me. Watch this." The caveman DNA is activated, and he thinks of the sharpest attack he can make against his prey. The lash-out is usually disproportional in its fierceness. You step on my new shoes, I stomp on your foot as hard as possible 5 times. You talk to my girl, I burn your house down. That's where we're at. This is petty. Ralph knows the one thing that brings peace and balance to this poor unfortunate loser, who is actually a brilliant writer, and he destroys it. This is the power he doesn't feel in his own life, and damn it feels good to squash the little defenseless guys. See, now you know how it feels. It has the appearance of justice, the kind that weak people yearn for. Tit for tat. Or sometimes tit for tat. I'll be damned if I let a lowly dwarf feel contentment when I can't even find peace of mind myself as a real man. Makes for a good villain, though, because we want to see justice exacted on him now. Vengeance is a cycle. None of us are immune. But we should try to avoid it because escalation is real. Mr. Bigelow, let's get his name right, is now roaming the fairground with a loaded gun, just like a bad guy in one of his crime stories. In those stories, the bad guy gets their comeuppance. The author gets to set the table and then pull out the tablecloth. He has the power to control a whole world where things happen as they should. That creative power is also addicting. A creative person is also attractive, as evidenced by Amy. This is true for musicians, actors, writers, everyone knows that. But you never know what's going on underneath the surface of a stranger's facade. If you, like Ralph, have a pretty good thing going on, but are still disgusted by what you see in the mirror, and you see someone with no prospects having a tiny moment of happiness, you'd better let him have it. There's no telling what domino you may be knocking down inside his walls. Ralph wasn't content to just badmouth Bigelow as he came and went in his pathetic little charade. He had to stalk the guy, hide like a hunter in the back halls of the funhouse, complimenting himself. Hey, at least I'm not a loser like this little freak. But you are. If this were an episode of the original Twilight Zone, Ralph would leave the boardwalk pleased with himself, only to be hit by a bus or get clipped by a stray bullet from a shootout on his way home. Bradbury has Amy running off to help with the search because she feels like it's all her fault for ordering the man a mirror of his own, which made Ralph angry and caused him to lash out at the poor guy. Her fault. Come on, women's lib. The final image is of Amy seeing Ralph's squished and ugly reflection in the wall of mirrors outside the maze, and Amy running away into the rain. Mirrors. In the 3rd century BC, most ancient mirrors were made of metal and had a round shape. The backside of ancient mirrors were all fancy, embellished with ornamentation and flourishes. They were made of highly polished bronze or silver, so not the perfect reflection we're used to. The first glass mirrors were invented in the 1st century by Romans. Damn Romans again. Look at me, I'm Rome. I can do this, I can do that. In the medieval period, glass mirrors completely disappeared because during those times, religious confessions stated that the devil is looking and watching the world from the opposite side of the mirrors. That's healthy. Poor, fashionable ladies had to use polished metal mirrors or special water bowls instead of glass mirrors. Then, in the 12th century, no respectful lady left her house without a small mirror. Image mattered even then. Then, of course, handheld mirrors became bejeweled status symbols for women who could afford one. Ladies wore gold-embellished mirrors on a chain around the neck or their waist. The pre-mirror people must have looked at these people like we oldies do at the TikTokers of today. Stop looking at yourself. It's not healthy. Glass mirrors came back only in the 13th century. This time they were bent slightly outward. The method of attaching tin to the flat surface of the glass wasn't invented yet. 16th century Venetian masters invented a flat mirror technique, using a special reflective mixture made up partly of gold and bronze. Because this magical mixture, yes, they actually believed it was magical. They also believed in alchemy, so anything reflected in the mirrors appeared more beautiful than in reality, the OG Facetune. It's not accurate, but it makes you feel better about yourself. Calling Mr. Bigelow. The cost of one Venetian mirror was comparable to the cost of one large military ship. In the 16th century, mirrors were thought to be used in mysterious rituals and witchcraft. Soldiers used mirrors to blind each other during battles. In 17th century Russia, mirrors were still considered a sin. In 1666, the Orthodox Church prohibited possession of mirrors even by its own priests. You can't trust those guys. It was once more than a wives' tale that breaking a mirror would bring you 7 years of bad luck. It was actually believed. And in some cultures, the person who broke it must make apologies to the mirror and had to carefully and respectfully bury it. When they weren't using them to blind each other, soldiers took mirror talismans to reflect away death. So the devil is looking and watching the world, but later, whatever. The point is, in terms of animal psychology, something does seem to happen when you look at yourself in a mirror. According to research by British social anthropologist Kate Fox, co-director of the Social Issues Research Institute, standards of beauty have, in fact, become harder and harder to reach, especially for women. This is no surprise. Mass media's vision of a satisfactory body is attained by less than 5% of the female population. Even attractive people who know they've met the high bar may not be looking in the mirror out of vanity, but out of insecurity. They are under an even greater pressure to maintain their appearance once they've got it. They may find it hard to trust any praise from their work or talents, because those positive affirmations might be influenced by how good they look. We are quite the neurotic subspecies, and we post-digital humans are even worse. But not all animals experience this the same. Dogs, cats, and horses don't realize that their mirror image is a reflection of themselves. They think they are face-to-face with another member of their species. I don't know about horses, but I've seen cats square off with their mortal enemy in the portal, their perfect match who suddenly materializes and then disappears when investigated too closely. That must be terrifying, seeing your own enemy in every shiny thing you come across. We great apes, chimps, gorillas, orangutans, and humans, are capable of recognizing ourselves in the mirror. When these other apes have been shown mirrors, they have invariably used them to groom themselves or make faces for their own entertainment. Human infants begin to recognize themselves in mirrors at about 2 years old. Female humans begin to dislike what they see only a few years later. Eve just had to bite that apple from the tree of knowledge of good and evil. Damn it. Now we're left with just enough self-awareness to recognize our flaws at every turn. 8 out of 10 women are regularly dissatisfied with their reflection, and more than half might actually see a distorted image. If reflections didn't exist, and the only face you never got to see was your own, you'd have to rely on other people's reaction to your face as a measure of your trustworthiness, your attractiveness. I must be at least attractive enough if she wants to come back to my cave with me. Then mirrors are invented, which let you see yourself as you appear to others, independent of their interpretation. Now you are them looking at you, judging yourself. Like hearing your own voice on recording, confronting your mirror image tends to make people squirm a little, change your posture, fix your clothes, your hair. Damn it, that's what I look like? I got some work to do. Or maybe I'll just hide. But if you love yourself, I heard these people do exist, and you're very confident and successful, you may actually see a badass in the reflection. You're satisfied with what you see. A lot of us will have to fight the urge to lash out at you. Look at that gorgeous Linda with her perfect teeth and long legs. I hope she slips and falls. Is that jealousy or envy? They are similar, but they're not the same. A psychotherapy tutorial on common cognitive distortions. Jealousy is the anger and fear we feel when we sense a threat to a relationship we have with a person or thing. I'm worried by my classmate chatting up my girlfriend so successfully. Why is she laughing so hard? Does she laugh that hard at my jokes? This implies an insecurity with what benefit I'm giving her. Ralph is angry and fearful that Mr. Bigelow might jeopardize his relationship with Amy. Envy is the negative reaction when someone else has a relationship with something or someone, even if it doesn't threaten our relationships. It bothers me that my neighbors get along so well. I wish I had a relationship like that with them. Ralph doesn't like that Bigelow seems, if only momentarily, to have a good relationship with himself, even a phony funhouse mirror version of himself, because Ralph never feels that happiness with himself. Let's say Ralph walks into a therapist's office. That's never going to happen, but let's just pretend. A good one would say, Ralph, let's look at the thought distortions that might be at play in each of these cases. If we can identify the faults in our thinking, it weakens those habits. Sure, Ralph says. Anything to release myself from the crippling clutches of self-hate and, all right, Ralph, we're going to try. So, the thought distortions. Go. Ralph thinks for a moment and then says, well, I love Amy and I don't want to lose her. If she shows interest in another man, even a measly dwarf, I will lose her. All or nothing thinking. Either a gal doesn't care about a guy or she's madly in love with him. Now Amy has expressed curiosity, so she might as well be in love with him. Okay, Ralph, Amy may be interested in him in any number of ways. But what evidence do we have that her feelings are so black and white? Is it really likely to be either 0 out of 10 or 10 out of 10? That's all or nothing thinking. Discounting the positives. Nothing good can come from her interacting with him. Well, Ralph, who's to say Amy won't get something beneficial out of interacting with Bigelow? Might it not be a good thing? That's discounting the positives. Emotional reasoning. Yes, but I really feel like she's going to cheat, so she probably will. Well, that's emotional reasoning. Just because it feels that way, does that make it true? Labeling. Look how self-conscious I am. What a jerk. Ralph, if self-consciousness and self-doubt makes one a jerk, then wouldn't the whole world be wall-to-wall jerks? Is that reasonable? Maybe you could substitute your self-talk with, I don't like feeling out of control like this, and I will try to process these feelings in the light of reason and not just fear and anger. Personalization and blame. That dwarf is a jerk for creating this situation. This is quite common. Ralph, Can this stranger really be solely to blame for how Amy feels? Maybe there are many factors and many people to blame. In this short story, Ralph is both jealous of Bigelow's threat to his relationship with Amy and envious of Bigelow's moment of self-pride. Both are based on his unfortunate feelings about himself. Self-consciousness is fine until it's not. It has a survival purpose. When we're assessing our own abilities and we always think we could do better, it leads to better outcomes. That's when it works. Other times it's one of Mother Nature's cruelest jokes. The thing that got us here safely will also torture us. But that's how it goes with humans until we discover tech that allows us to reformat our hard drives completely and rise up to the next level. I'm just kidding, we're fucked. The Dwarf is about a man who snapped, but didn't have to. However, he was playing a dangerous game, resting all of his sense of self on a distorted view of himself. If your only feedback on whether you're a good person is like one of those ancient silver and gold dust mirrors that lie, then what are you left with? The same can be asked of certain social media platforms which allow people to reflect a perfected image of themselves. What are you left with? If I see you on the street, am I going to see the airbrushed version or the real version? Do you not love yourself for who you really are? In most cases, I think the answer is obvious, but that doesn't mean we can't do better. Someone like Mr. Bigelow is a bomb set to go off, with just one thing keeping the fuse out of the flame. Unfortunately, these powder keg people are not uncommon. People tread water in a day job they hate, with a small number of things buoying them above the drink. Then someone parks in their parking space, and boom, they go postal. He seemed like such a nice, quiet man. I don't know what happened. He had a wife, a family, a decent job with benefits. I had no idea someone could just explode like that. In 1984, there was a man, a seemingly normal guy, except his fuse was dangling over a lit cigarette just waiting. They called him the Subway Vigilante. I never liked Charles Bronson. I never disliked him either. I thought he was just a bully. A tough guy glorifying punch him in the face if he mouths off culture. Then I heard about Bernard Goetz. You know, the Death Wish guy. No, not the actor, that's Bronson. I'm talking about the guy who would become associated with Bronson's character from that film. In Death Wish, a New York City architect becomes a one-man vigilante squad after his wife is murdered by street punks. In self-defense, the vengeful man kills muggers on the mean streets after dark. Well, Bernie Goetz was real, and so was the crime he was reacting to in the early 80s. In 1980, there were 1,814 murders in New York City. Muggings and assaults were the norm on the subways. If you got jumped down there at night, it was your own fault for being crazy enough to get caught down in the subway after dark. The cops did their jobs, but couldn't keep up. Like a lot of people, Bernie had gotten fed up with the crime and the filth of New York City, especially the subways. It felt like the thugs, the punk kids, were in charge down there. Why don't the cops do something? Doesn't anyone have any self-respect anymore? This place is a war zone where only the bad guys are armed. How's that fair? Or the little old ladies who ride the train and get jacked, have their purses stolen, or worse? Do I have to take care of this myself? This is Novel Meets Evil, and this is the nonfiction bit. A chilly Saturday afternoon in Manhattan, December 22nd, 1984. 4 young black men from the Bronx, armed with sharpened screwdrivers, Barry Allen, Troy Canty, and Darrell Caby, all age 19, and 18-year-old James Ramseur, boarded a downtown 2 train. This is the same Broadway 7th Avenue Express that I take home every day to Brooklyn. The teens had all been arrested and convicted of crimes at least once before, and admitted that on this night they were on their way to rob a video arcade in Manhattan. I don't have time to explain what a video arcade was. Look it up. Not a killing spree, just a robbing. The train thundered into the Chambers Street station in Manhattan and screeched to a halt at about 1:30 p.m. On the opposite end of the car, clearly keeping their distance from these 4 rowdy young men, were about 20 other passengers. The door opened, and in stepped a very skinny, very nerdy-looking white guy. "How you doing?" asked Canty, a bit too loud and in a fake friendly voice. "Fine," replied Goetz. The teens signaled to each other and got to their feet, approached the little dweeb, blocking him from the other passenger's view. Canty leaned in. "Give me $5. Goetz wasn't feeling it. Not this time. He refused. Canty repeated, "Give me $5. Goetz smiled and removed the Smith & Wesson .38 he'd been hiding in his coat. He'd been ready for this moment. He was having fun. Grinning, he lowered into a marksman's stance and fired at the men, hitting all of them. Goetz told police that after firing 4 shots, he walked over to one of the injured teens and said, "You don't look so bad. Here's another," and shot him again in the back. 2 of the other young men said that at this point they were begging. They said, "Come on, man, we only asked for the money, we didn't take it." So they weren't robbing anyone, just kindly making a request. One of the teens later admitted during an interview with columnist Jimmy Breslin that he and his friends had indeed intended to rob Goetz, who looked like easy bait. Well, Bernie had been saving up his rage, his outrage, over how far New York had fallen to roving gangs of hoodlums requesting money from scared citizens at knife point or simply with the old 5-to-1 like this. No one had pulled their screwdrivers yet. Luckily, no one was killed on that subway car, but KB's spine was severed, resulting in brain damage and paralysis. Those passengers who weren't frozen in place with fear ran to the other end and out of the car. According to Goetz's statement to New Hampshire police, Canty was lying on the subway floor to the right of a seated woman who had remained frozen in place. Allen was laying on his stomach on the same bench with his head on the woman's lap. Ramsher was slumped on the floor near the door, and KB was slumped on the floor near him, next to the conductor's compartment. Another woman near the center of the subway car had fainted and was lying face down. Goetz went and asked the women if they were all right, if they had been injured, and both said no, they were okay. The train conductor entered the car and said, "What the hell's going on in here?" He approached Goetz, who was still seated, and asked him what happened. Goetz pointed to the carnage and said, "I don't know. They tried to rob me and I shot them." The conductor, a little confused, asked if he was a police officer, and when he said no, he asked Goetz for the gun. Goetz replied, "No." The train did slow down and stopped before the next station. They often do this when an incident happens on board. Goetz remained seated for half a minute and then exited the car, climbed down to the tracks, and ran back the other way through the tunnel till he reached Chambers Street Station again, where he escaped up the stairs. He took a cab back home to 14th Street to get his escape kit and then rented a car and drove north. In Bennington, Vermont, he burned his blue jacket and dismantled the revolver, scattering the pieces in the nearby woods. He drove around New England for a few days, staying at motels under fake names and paying in cash. On December 29th, a call came into the New York City police reporting that Goetz matched the gunman's description, was known to own a gun, and had been mugged previously. 3 days later, Goetz called his neighbor, Myra Friedman, who tipped him off that the police had come around looking for him and asked to be notified if Goetz showed his face. Friedman later related the contents of the phone conversation where Goetz had said, "Myra, in a situation like this, you're in a combat situation. Your mind is functioning, but you're not thinking in a normal way. Your memory isn't even working normally. You're so hyped up, your field of view changes. Your capabilities change. What you are capable of changes. You're under adrenaline, a drug called adrenaline, and you respond very quickly, and you think very quickly. That's all. You think, you analyze, you act, and in any situation, you just have to think more quickly than your opposition. That's all. Speed is very important." Then he turned himself in at the Concord, New Hampshire police headquarters, telling the officer on duty calmly, "I'm the person they're seeking in New York." He was sent back to New York right away to face the music. Bernie Goetz was now infamous. Goetz admitted that 3 years before the subway incident, he'd been attacked in the Canal Street subway station by 3 men who attempted to rob him. The attackers smashed Goetz into a plate glass door and threw him to the ground, injuring him. Goetz assisted an off-duty officer in arresting one of them. The other 2 attackers escaped. When he found out that his attacker had spent less time in police custody than he did that evening, he was furious. This fury was compounded when this attacker was charged with only criminal mischief for ripping Goetz's clothes. Goetz subsequently applied for a permit to carry a concealed handgun, but this application was denied for insufficient need. He bought himself a 5-shot .38 caliber revolver anyway. Not good, but what should he have done that night? The pacifist in me says, just give him the $5 and keep it moving. But that's me almost 40 years later trying to place myself on that train car at that moment. I go through that station every day, but things are much better now. I can only imagine how scary it was back then, especially for someone who's afraid of people. You can find videos of the subways from that time on YouTube. Trash blowing through dimly lit tunnels, beer cans rolling down the platform past rats and dirty needles, blood and human waste on the steps leading up to the grimy streets. There was graffiti on everything, seemingly no attempt to prevent that. Even though it's not staged, it looks exactly like RoboCop. Grim, gritty, scary. Now that's a surface-level assessment, and if we just look at the surface, we may feel more than a little sympathy for this wiry nerd who fixated on the crime, the filth, the fear, the exploitation, the intimidation that had become just an accepted part of the New York City street culture. You're supposed to feel safe in your home, right? When Bernie lost his cool and lashed out at the first group of thugs who accosted him, a lot of New Yorkers were on his side. No one wants a shooting like that to happen, people said on TV news interviews at the time, but it's at least understandable. Goetz felt it was in the blacks' nature to attack defenseless whites, stealing what they could because that's all they could do, and thus his response should be seen as self-defense on behalf of the public. He had primed himself to expect an attack, and he was ready and waiting with a loaded .38. New Yorkers and New York papers hailed him as a hero. He was dubbed the Subway Vigilante. Bernard Hugo Goetz was born in the Kew Gardens, Queens neighborhood on November 7, 1947, the son of German immigrants who met in the U.S. His father was Lutheran, his mother was Jewish, but she converted to Lutheranism. Goetz grew up with 3 older siblings in upstate New York. At the age of 12, he was sent to Switzerland, where he and his sister attended boarding schools. Goetz returned to the United States in 1965 for university, earning a degree in electrical engineering and nuclear engineering from New York University. He was briefly married, lucky lady, but after his divorce, luckier lady, he moved back to New York City, where he ran an electronics business out of his Greenwich Village apartment. Bernhard Goetz was charged with attempted murder, assault, reckless endangerment, third-degree criminal possession of a weapon, and fourth-degree criminal possession of a weapon. He was only found guilty of third-degree criminal possession of a weapon and was found not guilty on the remaining charges. He was sentenced to 1 year in jail, but was released after 8.5 months. The incident sparked a nationwide debate on crime in major U.S. cities, and how far was fair to take self-defense, and the extent to which the average Joe should be able to rely on police to protect them. The New York criminal justice system came under increased public scrutiny and criticism, some being outraged that a white man with a gun, the quintessential bad boy anti-hero from American westerns, should be treated the same as a black man with a long rap sheet robbing someone at gunpoint. The National Rifle Association chimed in with campaigns to loosen restrictions for concealed carrying of firearms. Part of what complicated the discourse on the topic was the differing accounts of the shooting. Apparently, Goetz's statement to police about standing over the injured KB and shooting him in the back was not accurate. The witnesses on the train said the shots came in one burst and there were no follow-up shots. Bernie's one-liner made for a better story, a better movie soundbite, but it turns out it also didn't match the medical evidence. This made it easier to paint the picture of a man defending himself as opposed to an assassin. In Goetz's own words, I decided to shoot as many as I could as quickly as I could. I did a fast draw and shot with one hand, my right, pulling the trigger prior to the gun being aligned on the targets. All actual shots plus my draw time occurred easily within 1.6 seconds or less. This is not as difficult to do as some might think, and occasionally I give a description of the technique along with a reenactment. The first shot hit Canty in the center of the chest. After the first shot, my vision changed and I lost my sense of hearing. The second shot, lightning fast, hit Barry Allen in the upper rear shoulder as he was ducking. Later, the bullet was removed from his arm. The third shot hit the subway wall just in front of KB. The fourth shot hit KB on the left side, severing his spinal cord and rendering him paraplegic. The fifth shot hit Ramser's arm on the way into his left side. I immediately looked at the first two to make sure they were taken care of. and then attempted to shoot KB again in the stomach, but the gun was empty. I thought KB was shot twice after reading the media account that no shots missed. I had lost count of the shots, and whether under adrenaline I didn't even hear the shots or feel the kick of the gun. "You don't look too bad, here's another," is a phrase I came up with later when trying to explain the shooting while I was under the impression that KB was shot twice. KB, who was briefly standing prior to the shooting, was sitting on the subway bench during all attempted shots. The others were standing. Shortly after the shooting, my vision and hearing returned to normal. In a videotaped statement made after he surrendered, Goetz stated, he told police that while still seated, he planned a pattern of fire from left to right, so there was kind of premeditation, but only if the men decided to jump him. It's not really self-defense, but it's not self-defense. That's probably why it was a subject for every news program in America. Goetz performed a dry-fire shooting demonstration at 4 hypothetical targets on the biography channel show Aftermath with William Shatner. Could you imagine a black shooter being asked to come on TV and reenact a shooting he just committed? Race isn't the only factor at play here, but I'm just saying, come on. Once arrested, Goetz wouldn't shut up. He was given a Miranda warning and he waived his right to have an attorney present. In Concord, he gave consent to making an audiotaped statement. A 2-hour statement was recorded. That evening, New York City detectives and an assistant district attorney arrived in Concord, and Goetz submitted to a 2-hour videotaped interview. These interviews were played for the criminal trial and at a civil trial years later. Goetz described his previous mugging in which he was injured and the assailant never got punished. He complained that New York was lawless and said bitterly that its justice system was a joke, a sham, and a disgrace. It's believable that, in his words, he feared being beaten to a pulp and robbed. He denied any premeditation for the shooting, but clearly he was thinking about how to strike back at non-white criminals. When he spoke at a community meeting 18 months before the subway shooting, he voiced some of these concerns. "The only way we're going to clean up the streets is to get rid of the spits and niggers." All that angst building and building. To what? When the detective asked him what his intentions were when he pulled the gun, Goetz replied, "My intention was to murder them, to hurt them, to make them suffer as much as possible." He also said, "If I had more bullets, I would have shot them all again and again. My problem was I ran out of bullets." He added, "I was going to gouge one of the guy's eyes out with my keys afterwards, but decided not to when I saw the fear in the teen's eyes." At the criminal trial, Goetz's defense attorneys Barry Slotnick and Mark M. Baker argued that this and other extreme statements by Goetz were the product of emotion and an overactive imagination. When Goetz was arraigned a month later, his bail was set to $50,000. He was held in protective custody at the Rikers Island Prison Hospital. New Yorkers offered to help pay his bail, but he refused. This was his responsibility. Bernie Goetz, the Subway Vigilante, was front-page news for months, largely due to the conversation it generated in all large American cities, which were struggling with violent crimes in the 1980s. This was just a prelude to the George Zimmerman case much more recently. Like any juicy story, the Subway Vigilante gave an excuse to justify whatever prejudices or positions people wanted to support. Gun nuts used it as proof that people needed to be armed in times like these. Racists point to African American culture as out of control and in need of a Bernie Goetz-style smackdown. Anti-racists used it to illustrate the structural racism in the criminal justice system. Cops pointed to the need for additional police power. Anyone and everyone can play this game, and in 1984, the Bernie Goetz story was a perfect stage. One of the problems is that they all kind of have their own point, but it would be nice to see these divergent groups working together on a solution. I'm living in La La Land, obviously. It's clear to me that Bernie Goetz was looking for a reason to light up some thugs. If I can't feel safe down here, then neither can you. One unusual aspect of this case is the honesty with which Goetz spoke about his own racist tendencies. He admitted as much to Stone Phillips on Dateline NBC, saying he essentially chose these teens as good targets, not unlike how they had targeted him as easy money. He wanted minorities, the violent part of society, to pay for their transgressions and didn't see the system succeeding at this. From a place of privilege, he seemed blind to the fact that the system is already rigged against blacks particularly, and that they are already paying a hefty price every day for not being white. A month after the shootings, KB's lawyers, William Kunstler and Rob Kuby, filed a civil suit against Goetz. The civil case was tried in 1996, over 11 years later, in the Bronx. The jury found that Goetz had acted recklessly and had deliberately inflicted emotional distress on KB. Jurors stated that Goetz shooting KB twice was a key factor in their decision. The jury awarded KB $43 million, $18 million for pain and suffering, and $25 million in punitive damages. Goetz subsequently filed for bankruptcy, saying that legal expenses had left him almost penniless. When asked in 2004 whether he was making payments, Goetz responded, "I don't think I've paid a penny on that." And he's still walking the street? Privilege? New York City reached its peak criminality in 1990. The crack epidemic was largely to blame for this. Once the epidemic was over, there was still crack, but it was no longer ruling the streets. Crime in New York City dropped dramatically all through the 90s. Mayor Rudy Giuliani was considered a tough guy, tough on crime and hell-bent on cleaning up the city. A lot of people think he did. As surprising as it sounds, armed vigilantes were not a major factor in making the city safer. Goetz achieved celebrity status as a symbol of Americans who were fed up with the urban crime and chaos in the streets. In 2001, he ran unsuccessfully for mayor of New York City. There's no way to know if the Subway Vigilante case moved us culturally to really focus on crime, but of course Bernie thinks it did. He claimed that his actions were good for New York City and forced the city to address crime. In March 1985, one of Goetz's victims, James Ramseur, reported to police that two men hired by Goetz had kidnapped and attempted to murder him. Ramseur later admitted to fabricating the report. He said it was merely a test to see how police would respond when a victim was black. He was not prosecuted for this hoax. In 1986, Ramseur was convicted of rape, sodomizing, and robbing a young pregnant woman, so he was locked up at the time of the Goetz trial anyway. Ramseur was released on parole in 2002, but was sent back to prison for violating parole in 2005. He was released in 2010. In 2011, on the 27th anniversary of the shooting, James Ramseur died of a drug overdose in a possible suicide. He was 45. In November 2013, Goetz was arrested for allegedly selling marijuana, but the charges were dismissed. 2 months later, New York City largely decriminalized marijuana. Times change. I think of all those young men in prison for weed, and Bernie got the kid gloves. People snap. I've snapped, and it's a revealing experience. My friend in college filled my entire dorm room with trash, knee-high. It was a college prank and perfectly executed. He ran to his room and locked the door. I proceeded to ornament his door with terrible images in Sharpie marker and phrases that would definitely get him in trouble if he didn't clean them off. As it turned out, that night was the judging of the dorm's door decorating contest, and the director of our dorms walked right up to his door. She demanded an explanation, and he had to explain what happened. On the way to the police station in the back of a cop car, my buddy and I couldn't believe that our little back and forth had become public. It was never supposed to be public. We were terrified. In the police interview room, I explained that I had reacted to my friend's prank with an escalating strike back, and of course it was meant to be hyper-offensive. I didn't think, I just did it. If I had to spend the evening clearing garbage out of my room, I wanted to see him scrubbing the door all evening too. Payback. Clearly, the door decorating contest complicated matters. And boom, here we are. The male cops in the room shook their head and said, "You're teenage guys in college. We understand y'all go crazy on each other now and again. But in the future, try to think before you do things." A few years later, I was held up at gunpoint in Rock Creek Park in Washington, D.C., on my way home from band practice. I was walking on the barely lit sidewalk, a streetlight every 50 feet or so. And this guy rolled up on a mountain bike, jumped off, and pointed a gun at me. He said, "Get out of the light, move over to the bushes." "Yes, sir, no problem." I turned around and everything changed. My life flashed before my eyes in slow motion. I'll never forget, I thought to myself, my mom's going to be so messed up from the loss of her youngest son, and I won't be able to say goodbye to her. She'll never get over my murder. I don't know how to describe the feeling of being stripped of my sense of self, like it wasn't even me standing there, but just a thing. I looked down and I was involuntarily covering my genitals because I felt literally naked. The guy took my phone and wallet and told me to slowly walk to the top of the hill where I could take a cab home. But his partner was up there hiding, watching me, making sure I didn't go to the payphone to call 911. I had no choice but to believe him. In the cab, I went through some feels. I felt glad to have survived, but it soon started to sour, to ferment into a pure anger, that same brand of anger from the college prank overreaction. When he rode away, I'd seen him ride his bike unbeknownst to him right into my neighborhood. When I got home, I took a weapon and sat on my front stoop waiting for the man to ride by. If I saw him, I was going to kill him. I don't know how long I sat there, but eventually the anger subsided and I looked down at myself. I was waiting to ambush someone and God knows what. I ran inside feeling gross, feeling humiliated. Humiliated by the gun and also by my snap reaction to being robbed. I wasn't under my own control, for a few minutes anyway. That's something that can happen as a result of being traumatized, whether a gun is being pointed at you or maybe the one thing you hold dearest is taken away. Mr. Bigelow, just like Bernie Goetz, had reached a sense of fragile equilibrium, however pathetic it was, and he was just barely keeping it together. "All right, Bigelow, you're okay. Everything's fine. As long as you can see yourself in that mirror, you are in control of yourself. You remind yourself of who you really are. You're not just a pathetic dwarf. You're a man worthy of love, worthy of respect." But then his portal to sanity was gone. The floor fell out from under him, a sudden lack of control. He was in rage. He was in free fall. A dangerous situation for a hot-headed male and for those around him. I suspect that this pettiness is a high testosterone thing, so mostly a male thing. Someone slaps you, you feel the caveman DNA activate, you've lost cabin pressure, you hit them back with a brick. This tendency of my own to over-retaliate is something I will have to deal with. Knowing myself, to the small extent that I do, I can assess my flaws and adjust to them. It's okay to admit you're not perfect, as long as you use that awareness to do something about it. That's one reason I will never have a gun in my house. Why risk it? A dangerous character to be around is the macho male who has lost his sense of power. I picture the diminutive Mr. Bigelow and Bernie Goetz, small men made even smaller. Now he's compelled to stomp around wielding a weapon just to show people that he's here, damn it. I'm somebody. I have agency, and right now it's this gun. But you can't do whatever you feel like. You want to exact justice on the guy who cuts you off driving, or a neighborhood bully who makes your child's life a living hell. Don't. Bradbury paints the picture of this loose cannon loner, misunderstood, underappreciated, overlooked, with a fairly on-the-nose physical manifestation of being literally small, almost invisible. But narratively it works. I love Bradbury because he's never just talking about what is happening on the surface. Speaking through his hyper-independent character Faber in Fahrenheit 451, he proclaims, "I don't talk things, sir. I talk the meaning of things. I sit here and know I'm alive." Bradbury has lasted because he could weave things together. He could encapsulate the character of a Bernie Goetz, a Mr. Bigelow, in an almost silly scene at a carnival, Bradburian, and leave you with something to consider. He hides his examination of the human condition in bucolic green summer evenings with the smell of mowing grass and the sound of an ice cream truck. Meanwhile, the author is actually saying something about us. Read and reread The Dwarf if you'd like a glimpse into this speculative mirror, which isn't perfectly flat. It's the slightly warped but revealing world of Ray Bradbury.
Don't be scared. Subscribe to Season 1 for free in your podcast app. Then, be scared.